number 13, where it gives us a rhombus which I draw very poorly, EFGH. Remember when you label your shapes, you go clockwise. Which additional fact would prove that our rhombus EFGH was a square? Okay, so remember, a square, I should say a rectangle, is a square. So the property that we're looking for is one that is of a rectangle, or actually that is also a rectangle or a square, because rectangle is a square. It's getting late, friends. Sorry. So option A, that EG is congruent to FH. Okay, that means the diagonals are congruent. Now, that is a property of a rectangle. And all rectangles, I should say all squares, are rectangles. So that piece of information right there solidifies that to make the rhombus an actual square, those diagonals would actually have to be the same length. Okay. The fact that EG, the diagonal, is perpendicular to FH, that is already a property of a rhombus. And the fact that the angles are congruent and they bisect, again, those are all properties of a rhombus or a parallelogram anyway. So the only thing that stands out that is not a property of a rhombus is the fact that the diagonals are congruent. I'm going to do number 14 before I do 13 because it'll help make sense if we do 14 first. So it says place each quadrilateral in the bin that describes a property. So the diagonals are congruent. Now, I've already mentioned several times that happens, that it is a rectangle. All rectangles have their diagonals that are congruent. But you also have to remember that a square is also a rectangle. So both the square and the rectangle have diagonals that are congruent. Diagonals that are perpendicular. So remember, if you remember measuring the quadrilaterals, the rhombus had the diagonals form 90-degree angles in the center. But remember, a square is also a rhombus, so we can't forget the square either. And the last one, the diagonals bisect each other. Okay, this is actually a property of all parallelograms. Okay, and because the rectangle, the square, and the rhombus are all parallelograms, all three have that property. Okay. So, keeping that in mind, we can go back and... Okay. All right, now we can get back on track here. 15. A quadrat is a tool used in ecological surveys. A typical quadrat has 4 sides that are each a half a meter long. Okay, well, by definition, that means this thing is either a rhombus or a square. Because if all 4 sides are equal, those are our only 2 options. At what angle measurement should a diagonal meet a side to ensure that the quadrat is a square? Okay, what angle should the diagonal meet the quadrant? So the diagonal, so it's asking you at what angle would that be? Okay, so to ensure it's a square and not a rhombus, what makes, in terms of angle measures, what makes a square and not a rhombus is the fact that the angles are 90 degrees. So the diagonal would have to actually bisect that 90-degree angle into 45 degrees. Okay, one pair of base angles of an isosceles trapezoid each have a measure of 2 times x minus 10. The other pair of base angles of the trapezoid each have a measure of 4x plus 8. What is the value of x? Okay, so we have a trapezoid. So the base angles are here and here. And then in isosceles triangle, those base angles are congruent. So this is, if I distribute this, I get 2x minus 20. And it says the one pair each. So each angle is 2x minus 20. Then the other pair is 4x plus 8. Okay, what is the value of x? Now, while we know that those base angles are congruent, there's no other indication as to what the measurements of those angles are. So the only other piece of information that we know to be true, because a trapezoid is a quadrilateral, there is a total of 360 degrees in the quadrilateral. So if I add every angle up, or I could add them all up and set them equal to 360. But because we know that the base angles are congruent, that would mean that the two angles are 180 degrees. The sum of the two angles would be 180, because half of 180 is 360. Half of 360 is 180. So instead of adding all four angles and setting them equal to 360, I can add just the two angles and set them equal to 180, since two of the two pairs are congruent. So what I have is 2x minus 20 plus 4x plus 8 equals 180. So let's combine like terms. 2x plus 4x is 6x. And my negative 20 plus 8 is minus 12. Add 12 to both sides. I get 6x is equal to 192. And when I divide by 6, I get x is equal to 32. And that's what was asked of us. What is the value of x? It is 32. Okay. Last two questions. Number 17. In a kite, WXYZ. All right, so remember what's important about a kite is that the two consecutive, or the two angles right next to each other, are congruent. And let's label this W, X, Y, and Z. And these angles that meet the two congruent sides, the two that aren't congruent, the two consecutive sides form these angles to these opposite angles are congruent. So X is 90. Okay, so this is 90 degrees. And Z is 40 degrees. What's the measure of angle W? Okay, so again, the angles that meet the two non-congruent sides, those angles will always be congruent. And again, I have a kite, which is a quadrilateral, so I have a total of 360 degrees to work with. So when I do 360 minus the 90 degrees for angle X and minus the 40 degrees for angle Z, that leaves me with a total of 230 degrees remaining. And because W and Y are congruent, I can divide 230 divided by 2, and that is 115 degrees each. So that is the measure of angle W. Okay. The last question has to do with what we call, this is a XY, is what we call a mid-segment of a trapezoid. Okay, now a mid-segment, similar to a midpoint, connects the two centers of the opposite sides, creating so that TX is congruent to XW and UY is congruent to YV. Okay, so the property for a midsegment of a trapezoid is that the midsegment, in this case XY, is equal to half the sum of the two bases. So it would be half of TU plus WV. Okay, so it's essentially it's the average. XY is the average length for the two bases. Okay, so but when it comes to solving this algebraically, the key here is getting rid of that half. So XY is 29 equals, and I can write, so TU is 23 plus WV, which is 2x plus 17. I can also write this as divided by 2. Divided by 2 is the same as multiplying by 1/2. Okay, so first thing we want to do always is get rid of the denominator by multiplying it times itself. So when I multiply, but the thing is you got to remember to multiply both sides by 2. And then from here, life is so much easier. Because then we have just a straight algebraic equation to solve and no fraction. So 29 times 2, is that 48 or 58? Again, at this hour, I do not trust my mental math. It is 58. Okay. So, all right. So I got 58 is equal to, and I can add 17 and 23, which I believe gives me 40, if I do this correctly. Yep, that's 40. Plus 2x. To solve for x, subtract 40 from both sides, I get 2x is equal to 18. And when I divide by 2, x is equal to 9.